Use this to talk about enemy designs then. So, for those of you who are new watching this, Draken is working on a twin stick shooter, like a top down one. So, he's been asking me about some various topics regarding control, power up, stuff like that. So, enemy design is a very interesting point, and I'll talk about with the shooter, and then we'll kind of segue that into other games. But enemies obviously are the opposition to the player and can be very tricky sometimes to know just how hard to make an enemy, as well as just what the options are. For instance, I remember one of the things I didn't like about Teleglitch, which was that top-down shooter we played on stream a while ago, was that the starting enemies were just so annoying to fight. They were faster than you, and they just kept coming at you, and your basic knife just couldn't handle them. And a major part of enemy design is really about what are the player's options to deal with them. So, for your game, Draken, I guess, what do you think about in terms of how aggressive the enemies are, how hard they are to beat? Because there are many games that will purposely make the enemies overly difficult, so you either have to kill them before you get completely overrun, or that your basic weapon doesn't work. One of my favorite games are top-down shooters, which I'm sure you've probably looked up footage on or even played, was Smash TV. Smash TV featured a lot of enemy types that challenged the player in different ways. There was a Mr. Shrapnel. I'm sorry, my voice is dying. Mr. Shrapnel, who would walk around the corners of the screen, and if you didn't kill him in time, he would explode, creating additional enemies or different bullets to avoid. And I'm sorry, I need a drink. My voice just died on me. One of these days, I'm just going to drink an entire bottle of water, like in one fell gulp for everybody on stream. I love Smash TV as well. Super Smash TV was one of my favorites. And with Smash TV, again, like what Dragon's saying, one enemy is not a big deal. But when you have like 30 of them as like this blob coming across the stream to get you, then it becomes a case of prioritizing. Geometry Wars is another really good point there. In that game, many of the enemies would build up speed, I think, the longer they stayed on screen, so that if you didn't kill them in time, basically they would just, completely submerge and kill you. And you had to be fast enough. You need 30,000 VCRs and toasters. Speaking of, I didn't have lunch yet, so I'm thinking about having some toast when we're done with this stream. But enemy design in video games, the more complicated you make them, obviously creates more of a challenge on the player. But even with that said, though, you can have something very simple, and it can still be a nightmare to fight. And many people remember the infamous Medusa heads for Castlevania, which the pattern which is literally this. And despite that pattern, they were nightmares to fight back in Castlevania era because of the fact you had committed jumping, and your whip could only attack like in a horizontal line. So you had to extrapolate when to attack them when their wave was at this point. And if you missed, they would hit you. And of course, if you were on a tiny platform, and thank you, I was just about to mention them as well. The Red Devils from Ghouls and Ghosts were also a pain. Very basic pattern, but they flew very fast, and they would come at such an angle that if you didn't already know to jump at that point, they were going to hit you. And considering Arthur only had 2 points of health, they weren't very fun to fight. And again, there's many ways you can tweak enemies to make them easier or harder. Probably the gold standard today for enemy design would be the Souls series. The Soulsborne titles have enemies that they're not that complicated when you look at them. Most enemies only have maybe between 3 to 5 different attack patterns, but you have to read them in order to know how to avoid them. I remember this with Dark Souls 2, and when they started to change the combo design, And I'll get back to some of these simpler ones in a second for Draken. But in Dark Souls, in the original Dark Souls and in Demon Souls, the enemies were built on unique patterns for each attack. So let's say I swing my sword like this. That is pattern 1. Pattern 2 would be, let's say, a vertical slice. And then each one of those patterns would lead into additional attacks. So the horizontal would be slash, slash. What they changed with Dark Souls 2, and what we kind of saw grow out of Soulsborne, was that the combos would basically all have the same starting point, but would change the middle and end. So the enemy would have the same start of a horizontal slash, but then let's say they would follow up with a punch, or a vertical slash, or they would do like a grab combo. And you had to basically read the entire combo in order to figure out what the attack chain was. And this is obviously a lot harder than just saying, oh, if the enemy lifts his right hand up, he's going to do this. Or if he snorts really loud, he's going to do this attack. Now, getting back to like 2D and top-down based games, you can do a lot, I think, with various things to trick or change up their patterns. Here's a impromptu game design quiz. I'm trying to remember, was there a top-down shooter where if the enemy had like a different, like let's say they switch between two different colors, like a blue and a red. If you attack them when they're red, they do a different pattern than when they attack when they're blue. I want to say there's a game like that, but I cannot remember it. Again, you're talking to someone with like a game design encyclopedia in his head, so all these games tend to all begin to blur together. But another thing you have to watch out for is also just how crazy the game can get. Many games will feature enemies with different patterns, and there's a case where the patterns will overlap. This is very dangerous in a 2D game where if, let's say, my hand here, like all my fingers are enemies that are attacking at the same time, they're going to attack through each other, and there's no way to safely get in and hurt them, unless you have some kind of like overshot or super attack. Now, with a lot of basic enemy designs, another thing you can do to try and trick the player up is, again, like trying to figure out how fast you can make the enemies. Do they shoot bullets? What was your third enemy type you mentioned? Spews bullets and one that fires bullets at you from a range. I guess for you, Dragon, what's the difference between your two bullet type enemies? While you're answering that, you can even use different shot patterns to change up enemies. Oh man, what's the name of that game? All these games are like popping in my head, and I can't remember their exact name. What was it? What's also bad is I'm trying to remember the name of the studio, and that is also not coming to me. What was it? Was this it? Oh, here's another one, Draken. If you want some more inspiration, look up Pixel Galaxy. It's a top-down shoot-'em-up that features a lot of different bullet patterns and enemy types. Okay. So like you can get very creative with different bullet patterns as well. You could have enemies that shoot like a circular bullet. You can have enemies that create bullets as long as they're alive. Yeah. Again, depending upon how complicated you make the AI, can also change how enemies will play. You could even have enemies that boost other enemies, such as in Enter the Gungeon, where as long as there's enemies up, maybe the enemies move faster, maybe their bullets do more. You have bullets that turn to more bullets that turn into more bullets. There's just a lot of variety you can do in terms of enemy design like that. Oh, that really sucks. It has a very low review. I think that's also the other problem we have with these top-down shooters, is that they can become very repetitive. And the only way I could see you elevating that would be kind of adopting like a roguelike or procedural design for enemies or levels. But I'm going to assume that's going to be beyond your scope for a game that's due out in less than a month. But I think when it comes to enemy designs, you can look at the environment they're in, the actual enemy behavior, and even what their attacks can do to try and mix things up. Oh, man. You can even have enemies that spawn other enemies, such as in Gauntlet, and many, many more titles as well. Yeah, the genre is, I think, just it's very simple to make, but I think it's also very hard to stand out unless you go very heavy into aesthetics. Where's some other shoot 'em ups that have been released? The laser ball. Yeah, I mean, you can see there are a ton of shoot 'em ups and top down shooters being released. But the problem is just, you know, you really have. It's one of those things where you have everything and nothing in terms of enemy design. You can make like dozens, if not hundreds, of different enemies of varying speed, shot types, melee, they spawn stuff. But the question is just how interesting is all that if the player just stands there and just shoots everything and kills them before they even do much? And of course, there's a shoot 'em up that involves looks like hentai, because of course there is. Yeah, and we see that in like the Two and Bullet Hell, but I don't think we. It's one of those things where if we look at the two extremes, you have like the Two side over here and the very basic ones over here. There's still, I think, a lot of room for like a elevated take on top-down shooters. And that's a big point just in enemy design in general. That many games will just try and boost stats instead of creating interesting enemies. We see this heavily in RPGs. We also see them in basic action games, where it's just, oh, instead of making this guy more complicated, let's just give him 60 more points of health and let him kill enemies in two, or kill the player in 2 hits. It was one of the things I didn't like about Nier and Nier Automata, that when you play the game on hard, all it does is essentially lower your health to the point where most enemies will kill you in like 3 or 4 hits, while on normal you die in like 10 to 15 hits. It's not making it interesting, it's just making it harder. Let's see. Would Enter the Gungeon be considered a shoot 'em up? I don't know. Let's see. What else is in the bullet hell? Obviously more Two games. Oh, Beat Hazard. That's another interesting one. Starred Row, which we looked at. Yeah, but a lot of these are just the insane level that requires so much precision that it really hurts getting players into. I think that's another challenge about enemy design. I actually own Loaded, the original. I know they made a sequel too, which I do not have. Loaded was pretty good. And you can also do more like environment bonuses. You could have like, let's say, a smart bomb that could pop up. But I think the problem with a lot of the enemies is that you have to really get creative, but if you make them too hard, then it just becomes frustrating to fight. Like with Geometry Wars and with games that feature enemies that get faster as they stay alive, the issue is that it gets to that point where you are going to die. There's not much you can do. Yeah. And I think that's smart as well. Figure out what enemies you want and how to deal with them, and then come up with power ups to compensate. Spread shot, maybe like a rapid fire bonus, everybody's favorite, the invulnerability, etc., etc. But let me see. Is there anything else for enemy design? I mean, we could talk about 3D enemy design, but that is probably way too big. Of course, get them power ups. Just watch out for power downs. Game called Ink Plane that's all sketch figures or paper drawings of characters. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about, just to wrap things up about enemy design, there's also wave-based design for bosses, or even for normal enemies as well, where the enemy will change their pattern based on the number of damage they took. A good example from like a simple game would be the Binding of Isaac. There's that enemy that the more damage they take, they start to move faster and faster on the field. So you have to either kill them very fast to avoid that increased speed, or suffer the consequences. I would say Binding of Isaac would be another good one to look at for enemy inspiration. You have the spiders that hop around the map. You have enemies that just fly, teleport, lay bombs, lay spawners, stuff like that. But I think with that, since my voice is starting to go and I do have some other work I need to get done, I think we'll wrap up the stream for here. Tonight for the classic game night, I'm going to play Sacrifice, because I've been meaning to show that off, and it's a very interesting game to go back to. Mojo, I will look at the Discord, get the information, get things going for you that front. But thank you everybody for watching. If you would like to get this video or get this stream or part ad-free and uncut, be sure to check out our Patreon, patreon.com/GWBycer. If you'd like to hang out and talk game design with us, you'll find the Discord link down below, as well as the link to my first book. So be sure to check that out. I will see you guys later, but thanks again for coming out, and check back for daily discussions on game design here, and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and design of games. Until next time, take care.